Hey everybody, welcome to another dining room chalkboard lecture. Day 76. Here it is. We're getting close to the end of the term. This is the second lecture of week 9. There's one more week of lectures and then the term is done. Today's topic is the feminist critique of political liberalism, and I want to start off by saying that this is not going to be a comprehensive discussion or examination of feminism and the feminist critique more broadly. Just like the lecture on fascism was about the fascist critique of liberal individualism, not about the other facets of fascism that were in the article that was assigned, as well as that are important aspects of a sort of full analysis of what fascism is. This class is about liberalism and its critics, and I've chosen to examine the critics through the lens of their specific critique of liberalism, not always in the fuller scope of things. So just know that this is there are going to be things about feminism that I don't and can't talk about possibly in this particular lecture. It's a big class. A class in feminism, a 10-week class in feminism would be able to do a bigger survey. So enough of the disclaimer. What I'm going to do is talk about first the basic sort of landscape that feminists see in a liberal society, and then discuss how it is that liberalism maintains that landscape. The basic critique that feminism offers, broadly, but also specifically in this case, is that what we have in our society is we have a patriarchal power structure. And I'll just write the word patriarchy rather than writing patriarchal power structure, that's a shorthand for it. And what a patriarchal power structure is it's an unequal distribution of benefits and burdens across all domains of life that favors men over women, right? So it's an unequal distribution of benefits and burdens. Not just unequal across human beings, but unequal between the two genders. That most of the benefits accrue to men, and most of the burdens fall on women, or it is unequally distributed, and that is a result not of kind of natural distribution of benefits and burdens that occurs in kind of any sort of community or any sort of ecosystem or in any circumstance in the world. Like, if you take a balloon full of helium, the helium molecules are actually unequally distributed throughout that balloon, even though, well, I don't want to get into physics, it's ridiculous to even talk about it. Scratch the helium balloon example. The patriarchal power structure not only exhibits an unequal distribution of benefits and burdens, the power structure itself maintains that inequality to the benefit of men and to the detriment of women. And I say in all spheres of life. And what I'm going to focus on today is a binary distinction between those two spheres, between the public sphere and the private sphere. And I'm going to look at both of those and discuss first how it is that there is an unequal, or not how it is, what are the facets of the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens in each of these spheres, and how it is that liberalism maintains this distinction and maintains the factors and dynamics that perpetuate these inequalities. So, sort of to jump ahead, the spoiler alert is that liberalism, from the feminist perspective, upholds and perpetuates a patriarchal power structure. And I could even add that it reflects fundamentally a patriarchal view on the world. And I think that one of the things that one of the readings, particularly the reading on contract, demonstrates is that the sort of contractual idea that is at the heart of liberalism, it reflects already a male perspective, and reflects already a perspective not just that's male as opposed to female, but that upholds in both a kind of material and psychological ways the patriarchal society, the unequal distribution and the unequal status, the unequal power, the unequal material benefits that that basing your entire political theory on a contract, a social contract, and then on free exchange and free contracts within the society that's created by the original contract, is not just a male perspective. It also then fundamentally serves to reproduce the set of power arrangements that existed at the time, right? And so, put differently, the feminist critique of political liberalism is that liberalism protects the patriarchal society from dismantling. It protects patriarchy from women changing this unequal distribution of burdens and benefits. And in fact, it even protects it against some men doing that as well. So it protects male privilege. In the public sphere, what is the nature of the inequality here? Now, I have a bunch of different notes. I actually put my notes on these bigger post-it notes, so I'm going to pick them up one at a time. They're laid out on the table in front of me. I'm not sure why I did the notes this way, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense. One thing about the public sphere, this is the sphere of sort of the official world. This is where we have the economy, the political system, the culture, and society. Okay? And in liberal terms, the public sphere is supposedly a domain of equal rights and opportunities. And I'll just write equality here and know that I mean both equal rights and opportunities. This is the place where people are supposed to be equal. The private sphere is where inequality is allowed and where there's diversity. This is the sphere of individualism and individual choice and private action. And there's not expected to be equality there. There's expected to be equality of rights and opportunities in the public sphere. But as we know, in reality, this is in theory, right? This is in theory, I should put that, theoretical. And that's the promise that a liberal society makes. It makes the promise of equality in the public sphere. It doesn't promise equality in the private sphere. In fact, what it promises is protection for diversity and individuality and inequality in the private sphere, because that's where that's where individual sovereignty reigns, right? The private sphere is individual sovereignty. Again, in theory, and we'll see when we look at the feminist description of the patriarchal power structure, that sovereignty is very much unequally distributed, or the actual exercise of sovereignty is very much unequally distributed in the private sphere. So what happens over here? Well, men primarily benefit. Men have more of the benefits. And what are those benefits? Well, men earn more money in the private sphere. Men have a greatly unequal share of economic, political, cultural, and social power. Men face far easier forms of judgment of their behavior and have an easier time being recognized as having high status. Men also have more realistic, a greater range of realistic options for what they can do with their lives in the public sphere. Right? Women are not confined to being teachers and nurses and secretaries officially, but it's far easier for a man to say, well, I want to be a civil engineer, than for a woman to say, well, I want to be a civil engineer. Not in theory, right? And not even part of the cultural shift in our society has been the cultural messaging is shifting away from that. But in reality, men have far more options. Men don't face a gender double standard in terms of judgment. It's much easier for men to move around the world with confidence, knowing essentially that the public sphere is an arena that was built for them, and they do well in the public sphere. So this is really the arena of male dominance. And let's see, I'll talk about that later. This is the sphere of male dominance. We could actually think of this as the man's world. And in fact, for a long time, the public sphere was considered to be the man's world, and the private sphere, not the domain of individual sovereignty, but the family, the household, the community, right? That's what this is: family, household, community. I should have put individual sovereignty in a box because that's equivalent to the equality box. This was the women's world, right? So the kind of traditional way of putting this is the public sphere and this is the domestic sphere, right? Not necessarily just the private sphere. So I could put private and just put domestic as the sort of, I would say, the more traditional, the older way of referring to this distinction. But this is the man's world, right? And it's as much the man's world today as it ever was, even though it doesn't necessarily have that official distinction, right? People aren't really going, I mean, some people will, of course, but people are not going to, by and large, call the economy, the political system, culture, and society the man's world where women don't belong, right? Women are now welcome there, equally, in theory, but it's clear that men dominate this world. If you look at who holds positions of power in the economy, right? How many female CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are there? How many women head important banks? How many women are cabinet officials? How many women are in the U.S. Congress or in state legislatures? More, absolutely more than ever. But right now there are, I believe, 17 female senators, U.S. senators. Women make up 51% of the population, and usually somewhere between 53 and 55% of the electorate. Yet they make up 17% of the U.S. Senate. So there's essentially a 3-to-1 asymmetry in men's representation and women's representation in the U.S. Senate. It's a little less unbalanced in the House of Representatives now. There are a higher percentage of women getting elected to the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives is the less powerful of the two houses because there's not all that confirmation that goes on in the House of Representatives that goes on in the Senate. So the women actually are doing better in the chamber of Congress that is less powerful. And the statistics go on, the wage gap, all of the ways in which, opportunities to be at the upper echelons of all of these forms of power. Think about cultural power, right? There are women with cultural power. I think about like Madonna, Oprah, Elizabeth Warren. There are absolutely women who have cultural power. But there are far more men with cultural power, and while I hate to name names because then people are going to say, well, here's another woman with cultural power, there are more, I can't think of all of them, certainly, but I think the point can be accepted that men have far more cultural power. Men have more power over society in terms of what social norms are, who is right. Like that's part of the gender double standard. It's easier for men to get along in society. It's easier to be recognized as a powerful, confident man. This is both societally and culturally. The National Women's Soccer League is less popular and less economically powerful and less important to our culture than the men's soccer league, despite the fact that our men's national soccer team is nothing globally. The U.S. women's national soccer team has won 2 World Cups in a row, and the best female soccer players in the world play in the National Women's Soccer League in the United States, and yet those women are paid far less. There's less status. There are far fewer fans. Even here in Portland, where we actually have the Portland Thorns. I'm a fan of the Portland Thorns. I used to have season tickets with my daughter to go see the Thorns. The Thorns sell out their stadium, or almost sell out their stadium, and they have 3 to 4 times more attendance than any other of the National Women's Soccer League teams. But still, and Portland loves their Thorns, and Portland loves their soccer, but the Timbers are more beloved. They have bigger attendance. The men who play for the Timbers make far more money. Tickets cost a lot more for the Timbers. And this is just a demonstration of the inequality and the male dominance in the sports arena. Right? Women's sports are not seen as big of a draw, as culturally important. So if you're the MVP of the WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association, Who knows your name? If you're the MVP of the NBA, everybody knows your name, right? There is a LeBron James in the WNBA. I don't know who that is, actually. I'm not a basketball fan, so I don't beat myself too much for this. I know who the champions of who the greatest female soccer players are, because I don't follow men's soccer. But I don't need to sort of go on and on about the male dominance of our culture, of our society. Basically, the facts line up that the public sphere is, despite theoretical equality, that there is a major gap in between the theory and the reality of men's and women's lives in the public sphere. Okay. In the private sphere, this is the sphere. We could call this the women's sphere. I won't, but this is where we have male dominance. On this side we have women's exploitation or female exploitation. I'm going to possibly try to keep the board parallel here, right? And women get the burdens. And what is the nature of women's burdens in the private sphere? Well, again, some of these are psychological or sort of abstract, but some of them are very much material. Women do far more of the domestic labor. They do the cooking, the cleaning, the housework, right? Women face far more sexual violence and physical violence than men do. Women are the default provider of both childcare and emotional support for everybody in the family, right? Like even imagine like and this is way more common, a two-parent household, a traditional sort of heterosexual, heteronormative family with a mother and a father and kids, and both parents work, right? Which is still like, there are few families in which the woman works and the man doesn't. There are a few families where the woman works and the man doesn't, and the man does even close to the half of the domestic work, much less all the domestic work. There are plenty of households in which only the man works and the woman does all the domestic labor. There are plenty of households in which now, more and more, where both the man and the woman work, but the woman still does the majority of the domestic labor and the child care and the nurturing, the emotional support, right? So just picture a man and a woman both work, and they both come home from work. The expectation is that the woman is going to provide the emotional support for the man. He had a hard day. She's going to provide emotional support for him. The kids have homework to be helped, and they need to be kind of corralled and taken care of. The woman is expected to do that. A man who does the things that traditionally women are expected to do in the private sphere is considered to be a hero, and a woman who does it is not considered to be a hero in any way, right? A man who does even half of the cooking, right, or even less than half of the cooking, a man who does some of the laundry is a heroic person. I have personally experienced this inequality, and I've been on the beneficial side of it, right? I do almost all the cooking in this household. I do almost all the laundry. And when people hear this, I'm a hero, right? As opposed to like, oh, good, okay, you're contributing to the household like a member of the household, right? If my wife said, if this were the case, if my wife said, I do almost all the cooking and I do most of the laundry, people would be like, oh, okay, great, why are you bragging, right? There's, men get to brag or get to be seen as bragging or are considered to be heroes for this, and that's because I think one of the biggest differences is there's a differential expectation here. If the public sphere is the domain of theoretical equality, the private sphere is actually the domain of differential expectation. Men and women are seen as, it's okay to have a different idea about what their roles happen to be. Interestingly, of course, is it doesn't flip the other way. Like, a woman who earns way more money than her husband is not considered heroic for that. In the same way that if a man does even half of the housework, he's considered to be heroic, right? And certainly if a man does all the cooking and all of the cleaning, he's considered to be heroic. If a woman is the sole breadwinner for a family, that's actually not considered heroic, even though it should be considered heroic. Like if you covered up the gender and said this person does half the domestic chores and earns all of the income for the household, you'd be like, well, that's the hero of the household. And then you uncover it and it's a woman, you're like, oh no. And part of the reason why women are not considered to be heroic for earning more money is because there's the potential for inadequacy and resentment on the part of men. Like men are supposed to, this is the differential expectation, men are supposed to earn at least as much as or more than their wives. And there are a bunch of good studies that show that when women begin earning equal to or more than their domestic partners, there's a growing sense of inadequacy on the part of the men, and that reflects back on the women. And instead of the women saying, well, great, I'm making more money now and I'm contributing more to the household, the women now, because the expectation is that they're providing the emotional support for every member of the family, is now they have to worry about the man's feelings being hurt, right? If a man gets a $10,000 promotion and now makes $25,000 more than his wife, that's a cause for celebration. If a woman gets a $10,000 promotion and is now making $5,000 more than her husband because she was making $5,000 less, that's a cause for celebration for the household overall, but it's also a cause for concern and worry by the woman because of the potential resentment and inadequacy and feeling of like not being a man enough to make most of the money. There are also a narrower horizon of opportunities and expectations for women. This connects with the public sphere. How do women define themselves as a person, as an individual? Well, wife, mother are like, if you're a man and you don't have children, you're a man without children. Or actually what you are is you're a man. If you're a woman without children, you're a woman without children. You're not just a woman, you're a woman without children. And there's this, well, what's wrong with you? And did you choose it? And can you not have kids? A 50-year-old man, I'm a 50-year-old man, will not get necessarily asked by somebody who doesn't know him, doesn't know me. They won't say like, oh, do you have kids? And even if they do, if it's a question that just kind of comes up, a general question, and if I had said, no, I don't have kids, be like, oh, here's a 50-year-old man who didn't have kids. That's one of the available options for a man. That is, and this is where when I talked about sort of the different judgments, there's different judgments in both of these spheres, and they're a lot of them the same. The gender double standard exists across spheres, right? I should just put that. We have a gender double standard. A man who doesn't have children is just a man. A woman who doesn't have children there's something wrong with her. Men don't have to ask themselves when they're growing up, do I want to grow up and get married? Do I want to have kids? Do I want to sacrifice my career for my kids? There are a whole set of questions that men just don't have to ask themselves that women ask themselves, and largely because society is asking them those questions, and the expectations are narrower, right? If you're not a wife and a mother, what are you, right? Well, if you're not a husband and a father, that's not a problem necessarily at all. One of the things that occurs over here is the benefits over here are both material and psychological. Though really the psychological benefits just flow from the material benefits. Men have no trouble having a higher level of confidence, a higher level of self-esteem, because the public sphere is built for them, and men succeed there, and they get the promotions, they get the positions, they get the status, they get the recognition. So the material benefits are sort of primary. The burdens over here are both material and psychological. And the material burdens are that women have to do more of the domestic labor, they do more of the childcare, they do more of the emotional support. There are also the burdens of the gender double standard and of the narrowed expectations and of the differential expectations between what men and women are supposed to do. There's also then just the greater threat of physical and sexual violence. And there's toil and insecurity all around for women. One of the things that does is that actually, and I'm going to pull my notes up here and just read exactly what I wrote, it limits the available time and energy for public sphere activity, right? Limited time and energy for succeeding in the sphere where they're allegedly, in theory, equal. And that's actually one of the things that reinforces the the de facto as opposed to the theoretical, the de facto inequality as opposed to the theoretical equality. It's not that women can't run for office. It's not that women can't get executive positions. It's not that women can't have cultural power. Partly the gender liberal standard makes all of those things harder, right? That definitely does, right? If you're a woman running for political office, then the child question comes up, right? Do you have kids? And if you don't have kids, then there's like, well, why not, right? And if a male running for office doesn't have kids, it's not that big of a deal. But if she does have kids, they better not be little kids because, well, who's going to raise them? Like, well, you know, no one asks the male running for office who has little kids who's going to raise them, right? No one says, oh, those poor children aren't going to have their father around because he's going to be at the state capitol or in Washington, D.C. doing the public business. So there's the gender double standard is one of the pieces that limits the realistic equality or the theoretical equality from becoming a equality in reality. Another big one is that women have less time to dedicate to this sphere because the expectations are so much that they like, okay, so if you're a woman who has a high-powered job, just like her husband does, right? Let's say that we have a couple and they're both high-powered lawyers. And let's just say that they graduated 1-2 in their law school class. That's where they met. She was number 1, he was number 2. They both went out and they got high-powered jobs. Now, if they have children, the expectation, the inequality of the burden is the expectation is that women are going to be the primary child care giver, and that means already the woman has to be like, well, okay, are we going to dedicate, are we going to dedicate a lot of our money to a nanny and to child care? And even then, even when that happens, the woman is still going to have to do the mopping up the rest of somebody who's going to relieve the nanny, right? Who's going to come home and relieve the nanny? There are going to be men who come home and relieve the nanny while the wife stays until midnight at the law firm, working her ass off to make partner, but way more often, right? Everything I say here, there are exceptions to all these rules, and particularly now there are more and more exceptions, but the fact is that while the patriarchal power structure has loosened up over the past, call it 50 years, it is still largely intact because the things that I'm saying are not on the brink of disappearing, right? The gendered wage gap is not, 98 cents to the dollar. The difference between male and female representation in Congress is not 5 to 10%, it's 35%, right? So while things have loosened up, and there's reason for cautious optimism about the distant future, the fact is that the patriarchal power structure is largely intact, even if there have been a few loosening ups here. But so there are going to be some couples where the woman is the one who gets to stay until midnight at the office working her ass off to become partner, and the man comes home to relieve the nanny. But by and large, that's not the case. And that kind of ripples out into all kinds of ways. One of the things that is a challenge for women in the political sphere, and also I would say in the economic sphere, but very directly in the political sphere, is that part of political success comes from building a network of supporters and building the kinds of connections that you can use to raise money, get support, get encouraged, get plugged into the party so that you can get elected. Women just don't have as many opportunities to build those networks and build those connections. One of the examples that was given to me by a woman, Jillian Shoney, who runs an organization here in Oregon called Emerge Oregon, which trains women to run for political office. They recruit, train, and support women to run for public office. She said one of the problems that women face is that when one of the first things you have to do before you can actually be a viable candidate is how could you raise money? Who are going to be your supporters? What is your network going to look like that you can build on to run for public office? And one of the things she told me is that men stay after work and have beers, and women tend to have to go home and skip the having beers after work to do their unequal share of the childcare and of the household work, and just the having of beers with other men. It's both a literal thing as well as a metaphor. Women have less opportunity to go have beers with the guys or whoever it happens to be, and that is one of the fundamental building blocks of a support network for a political career. It's also, a fundamental building block for economic success as well, right? Just the kind of classic, true story, but also maybe a little like a caricature of success in the economic world is the law firm, right? So to make partner, what do you have to do to make partner? You have to stay until midnight. You have to work weekends. You have to do all of the glad handing of the senior partners. You have to be available for late client dinners and drinks and all of this stuff. And in theory, women are available for all of that at the same level that men are. In reality, because of the gender double standard and because of the differential expectations, which is part of the gender double standard, it doesn't work out that way. And it really could be even just a minor difference, right? The difference between having to come home to relieve the nanny at 6 and getting to come home at 8. It's not even that it has to be half a day or that many hours. That's a big difference. Just the 2 hours between 6 and 8 o'clock when the male can go out for beers with his coworkers, with the senior partners, who are likely to be, because of the patriarchal power structure, the senior partners are likely to be men, right? And he as a man is going to feel more welcome, and because in the public sphere particularly there's less judgment of a man can go to for beers after work with the senior partners being a little bedraggled looking, right? And in fact, if he's tired looking, it means he's working his ass off. A woman who goes out for beers or drinks with the senior partners after work can't look bedraggled because those senior partners are probably going to be, well, she's just, I don't know, like it's not even a conscious judgment of like, ooh, put on some lipstick, so much as there's just that unconscious judgment that, well, maybe she's, she doesn't have her shit together. She's a man who looks bedraggled is going to be seen as a hard worker. A woman who looks bedraggled is going to look like she doesn't have the energy to sustain the trajectory to partner. So in the private sphere, there's more burdens that are both material and psychological burdens that are laid on women. In the public sphere, there are more benefits that are accrued to men. And that is the unequal situation. That's the patriarchal society that exists. Now, how does liberalism play into this, right? Because it would seem like what liberalism does is it promotes equality over here, which it does in theory, right? And if reality hasn't caught up to theory, that can't be liberalism's fault, right? Liberalism has promoted this equal rights and equal opportunities for both men and women. And even though it wasn't like that at the beginning, it is that way now, or, the main theoretical works that underpin liberalism are not gendered in nature the way they were in Locke's day and Jefferson and Adams' day. So liberalism does it, and liberalism also promotes individual sovereignty in the private sphere, right? And so people can choose how they live their lives. They can decide what conception of the good they pursue, and they choose for themselves and what conception they pursue. And liberalism doesn't tell women that they have to narrow their scope to wife, mother, secretary, nurse, whatever it happens to be, the more narrow range. And that's a little too kind of mid-20th century list of what women are limited to. But it is not that much different now. The list is longer of careers that a teenage girl can be like, oh, I could go into this career. But so liberalism isn't to blame, right? And liberalism is in fact should be seen, I think, from the point of view of the liberal proponents, is supposed to be seen as in fact a support for the feminist goal of greater equality of the benefits and burdens, greater equality of actual existence or exercise of individual sovereignty. So why is it that we can actually blame liberalism for the perpetuation of the patriarchal power structure. Instead of saying, well, liberalism is part of the process of dismantling the patriarchal power structure, and the patriarchal power structure is so deeply embedded through thousands of years of culture and history that we shouldn't blame liberalism for not being able to dismantle it overnight or even in the course of a couple of centuries. It's working on it. The feminist critique is not that there should be other tools added to liberalism's tool of dismantling. The feminist critique is that liberalism reflects and upholds the inequality that is here, primarily by maintaining this distinction between the public and the private sphere. This line is, we can actually think of this as the line between our, where rights are defined. The harm principle defines this line. When people's actions affect others, that's where public power comes in, right? So I could put the harm principle here. I haven't talked about the public-private distinction as I've described liberalism in the past. I've mostly talked about like the sphere of rights protection and the limitation of the state to protecting rights. And based on the fact that the state's only job is to determine and enforce the harm principle line. But this boundary creates a couple of things. One, what we get is liberalism promotes over here gender equality, formal gender equality, right? And one of the things that does is it can bury the actual realistic inequalities that exist. So let's go, well, women are allowed to run for office. So we can't blame the system of, we can't blame the electoral system or the political system for the fact that more men win office. Women are allowed to run for office. There are not these legal and constitutional barriers. There are laws that require equal opportunity in hiring, in housing, but of course we can't enforce cultural and societal inequalities. But women are equal, and what that does is that actually takes away a focus on the inequality, because men can just say, well, no, you have all the opportunity and all the rights that we have. So if a man wins over a woman in an office, or if women don't even run and there are far more men who are holding office, if there are lots more men at the top of Fortune 500 corporations, that's not our fault as men. That's not the fault of the public sphere. That's not the fault of liberalism. So the idea of the theoretical equality can paper over and can essentially make the critique that, but wait a minute, formal equality doesn't mean anything. It's just on paper, right? What is needed is actual real equality on the ground. But liberalism, by saying this domain is characterized, and we can point to all the stuff, right? We can point to all the Supreme Court rulings, we can point to all the laws, we can point to voting rights. We can even say, women, as I said earlier, women actually represent a larger portion of the electorate than men do. Women's turnout rates are higher. So, you're doing great. So if there's still inequality over here, that's not the fault of the system. Right? And then there's this, I would say, unstated kind of argument that maybe it means that women aren't as well suited over here, right? It means that if there aren't more women running corporations, maybe it's true that women shouldn't be running corporations. And if there aren't as many women in the Senate, then maybe it's just that men make better senators, right? And it buries the role that the gender double standard plays, and it buries the role that the fact that women actually have less time and energy to dedicate to this sphere than men do, because women are saddled with a greater level of burden over on this particular side. So liberalism maintains this fiction, this notion that equality actually exists, right? When the feminist critique is equality doesn't exist if it's only on paper. This equality, theoretical, right, may as well just cross the word out, because if it's just theoretical, then it doesn't really exist. But liberalism focuses on formal equality of rights and opportunities. And that buries this fact that there's actually an unequal distribution of benefits on this side. It buries the male dominance of this. It doesn't necessarily deny it so much as it buries its importance. If men are doing better over here, it's just that men are doing better over here. It's not that women don't have an equal set of opportunities. The bigger reason why liberalism is a culprit in sustaining the patriarchal power structure is that this sphere right here is immunized from public policy solutions. Private life, and this is the second article about Roe versus Wade, makes this particular point, and I'll read a quote from it. The existing distribution of power and resources within the private sphere will be precisely what the law of privacy exists to protect, right? So we have an unequal distribution of expectations and burdens and time and energy over in this sphere, and when there is a sharp line drawn between where public power can go. Public power can dictate things in the economy, in the political system, in culture and society, but public power can't go into the family, the household, the small community. Then that distinction essentially says, well, any struggles over in here are purely individual struggles. They're not a struggle of public power. So, and I'll read more of the quote. The legal concept of privacy can and has shielded the place of battery, marital rape, and women's exploited labor, has preserved the central institutions whereby women are deprived of identity, autonomy, control, and self-definition, and has protected the primary activity through which male supremacy is expressed and enforced. Let's see. The right to privacy is a right of men to be let alone to oppress women one at a time. It embodies and reflects the private sphere's existing definition of womanhood. So a big part of why liberalism is seen as not just failing to live up to its promise of equality in the public sphere, but actually being an actual culprit in maintaining the patriarchal power structure, is that an entire giant sphere of life in which there is clearly an unequal distribution of burdens and benefits, clearly an unequal distribution of expectations, the idea, the very liberal concept of what individual sovereignty is supposed to look like is just not a reality for women, right? Choosing your conception of the good, right? Even just think back to the idea, like, okay, you're a little boy. What are you going to be when you grow up? What do you want to be? How do you want to direct your life? Like, that's a wide open field of questions. For a little girl, that is not as much of a wide open field of questions. There are pre-selected conceptions of the good. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be women who break out of all this stuff. This doesn't mean there aren't going to be individual cases of women who, within here, without any kind of support from the economy or the political system or the broader culture of society, are going to find a way to, not have children, not get married, become novelists, live their lives the way they want to, fully exercise their individual sovereignty the way that sort of liberalism says that we're supposed to within the private sphere. Of course that's going to happen, right? Does it happen much? No. Is there anything like symmetry between men's ability to exercise individual sovereignty in the private sphere and women's? There isn't. And what liberalism does is it protects this world from critique. It also, because there's such an emphasis on individualism, it isolates women and divides them from each other. It prevents them from noticing or acting against their collective exploitation, right? This sphere is one of female exploitation. But by saying, well, that's your household and that's your life and it's a private world, it's a private life, it allows women to, or it creates a situation in which women are divided from each other. It also, and this is the thing that I think that is the most important, it prevents public policy solutions from entering. Like, if it's not a question of rights, you can't even talk about it in the public sphere, right? And the idea of limited horizons for what you're going to do with your career, with whether or not you have to answer the question of, am I going to have kids? What kind of household am I going to do? You can't legislate who does more laundry. I mean, you can legislate who does more laundry. It's theoretically possible. In a fully democratic community, not a liberal democratic community, but in a fully democratic community, the management of a household would be a potential subject for public policy analysis. This dividing line, though, prevents public policy solutions from entering this area. And so what it means is whatever inequality exists here, and there's a huge amount of it, even more here than there is over here. Because here at least there's a promise of equality, and what that's meant has there has been greater progress. The gender wage gap has narrowed. The number of women running corporations and in positions of political power has increased. The number of women who have cultural and social power has enlarged, right? Slowly, but it has. This domain is not accessible to a discourse of equality, right? It's actually protected from the discourse of equality. And women are, since they see themselves as, well, you're supposed to choose your own life over here. If you're choosing within a narrow set of expectations, you'll feel like you're choosing it. I think a big thing is that the feminist critique is that women get divided. Individualism is an atomizing force, and it divides and fractures collective power, right? So women are collectively exploited by a patriarchal society, but in the private sphere, their exploitation feels individual. It feels separate. It isolates them. And probably more importantly than that sort of psychological isolation and distancing and fragmentation of collective female power is this. That if women wanted to make a change, to organize, to engage in collective action, to bind themselves together in a movement more strongly and more powerfully and more dedicatedly, the fact is that when there's an unequal share of burdens by women, they have less time and energy to dedicate to any kind of collective action, any kind of collective solution. And the liberal distinction between the public and private sphere prevents that collective action from even attacking certain kinds of things, right? You can't legislate differential expectations for careers. You can't legislate the difference between the burden of domestic labor. You can legislate things like sexual violence and domestic violence, but under the existing kind of liberal way of looking at harms, if a woman who is beaten or raped by her husband doesn't press charges, there's not the opportunity for other women or anybody, right, to essentially press charges on her behalf. That's an individual decision. So, like, your children can't press charges against the father for beating and raping the wife. The friends, the sisters, the mothers, the uncles and aunts, they can't do that. That is what that does, is that prevents there from being collective action to transform the nature of the private sphere. Now, the way that liberalism maintains its sort of indifference to this is by saying, this is not a realm in which in which diversity and equality is a problem, right? What this realm is that in fact it's for diversity. It's for different choices. People are going to choose to live differently, and so there's this, much like there's a sort of theoretical blinder over here, like, well, in reality, women have less economic and political, social, and cultural power, but in theory they have the same amount, so they should go out and get it. Over here, it's just like, well, there's not a problem, because when we have inequality, when the household burden of emotional support is drastically unequal, that's just choice. That's people's choices, right? If women are the primary emotional support for the entire family, right? They have to support their own trials, and they have to support the trials of their husbands and of their children, and no one supports them, then they can choose not to. That's their choice. This is a domain of individual sovereignty. So liberalism essentially turns a blind eye to the inequalities that actually exist and say, reality doesn't matter. And this is actually a critique that shares some similarities with the Marxist-Leninist critique, which points out that the liberal attitude towards rights is a sham that is designed to support the existing power structure. In the case of the Marxist-Leninist critique, the sham and the false consciousness support the existing economic power structure, the class-based power structure. Quite a lot of feminist thinkers, particularly in the mid-20th century, drew on Marxist analysis to make a gendered version of that same attack on liberalism and that same claim that this idea about the private sphere being a place of individual sovereignty, right? The reason why we police this line is so people over here can make their own choices. That is a sham covering up the fact that false consciousness reigns, and part of the way you maintain that false consciousness is by saying to people, well, you have all the choice in the world. You know, if you're a worker and you don't want to work for this corporation for this amount of money, then don't work there. You have that choice. We've maintained, you have that right to free exchange. That's part of your protected individual sovereignty. That's a way of ignoring the economic reality that almost every worker faces, which is that it's not really a choice when you go to work for somebody for the whatever wage the free labor market actually makes the prevailing wage. The same thing can be said for the differential, particularly the differential expectations, that it's not freely chosen, and it's in fact, it's deeply embedded in thousands of years of patriarchy and in our cultural attitudes. And when men have most of the cultural power, this is where this line is actually, it's maintained in theory but not in reality. Cultural power, the male dominance of cultural power of magazines and films and music and all of the things that give people their ideas, or that give people most of their ideas about how to live their lives, that shape our conception of the good and that shape the way we use our instrumental rationality to pursue what we think of as our conception of the good, are dominated by men. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that the inequality of expectations, the differential expectations that have existed for thousands of years, would be maintained. And liberalism maintains this fiction that, oh, well, all women, just like all men and women, have equal choice. So, and everything's a free exchange in this domain, as long as we protect this boundary. So if a woman is doing more of the domestic labor than a man is doing, that's a result of a free exchange, right? Like that's just like saying, well, you know, in the economy, when one person, gets more benefits of an exchange, more financial benefits of an exchange than the other person, that's just the way free exchange goes, right? There's a willful blindness to the fact that this differential expectation is maintained largely by the cultural power, though also by the economic, political, and social power, but largely by the inequality of access to this maintains the differential expectations. This is maintained by patriarchal power. And so there's an illusion of choice. And the critique is that what liberalism does is it shines a light on something that's actually non-existent. Just like over in the public sphere, it shines a light on this equality, right? Look, women and men have equal rights and opportunities. It's written down, it's in the law, it's in the Constitution. It wasn't always like that, and we're sorry about that, but we've gotten there now, right? So just ignore the part where actually, in reality, men actually get most of the benefits. So theoretically, what does it matter, right? If you're a woman, what does it really matter if theoretically you're not supposed to be paid a differential wage, or if theoretically women have all the same opportunities to run for public office as men do? If because of this and because of this particularly limited time, you don't actually have the realistic chance of winning offices as much as men do, then this theoretical thing matters very little. Individual sovereignty over here matters very little if the differential expectations that create that essentially create more burdens for women and that uphold female exploitation. In theory, sure, women have the choice not to be exploited, but I mean, except in the cases where they actually are sort of physically, imprisoned, and there's sexual trafficking and there's domestic abuse and sexual abuse. Those are theoretically like they belong over here because the harm principle says, well, those women are actually being harmed. Though part of the differential expectation maintains the fact that a lot of things that do belong over here, a lot of harms, are actually contained in the household. And that's actually, I think, what a big part of that privacy versus equality, the Roe versus Wade analysis, is pointing out, is that it protects this domain from too much investigation. The final quote that I want to read is, let's see, where is it? It is a very material division that keeps the private beyond public redress and depoliticizes women's subjection within it. So it takes women's subjection in the private sphere out of the public sphere entirely. And so liberalism is not just too slowly dismantling the patriarchal power structure as it promises to do. The adherence to this distinction and the fiction that theoretical equality and theoretical individual sovereignty are what we should be focusing on, and don't ignore the reality, right? Don't look behind the curtain where you would see that women are still paid less, that women still have less economic power, women still have far less political power. Don't look behind the curtain where we see that women doing more of the domestic labor, women doing the vast majority of the emotional support, women being vastly overrepresented as victims of sexual and physical violence in the home, women having a narrower set of life expectations. Don't look there, because look here, look at individuals. They have the choice, right? And we protect that choice. So if women choose, if a woman chooses to be a wife who does most of the housework and who gives up her career for the family, that's her choice. A big part of the feminist critique is, and the concept of false consciousness that I mentioned when talking about Marxism-Leninism is often used by feminist critics as well, that it's a false consciousness that you actually have this choice, that workers have the choice, and that therefore their unequal material status is a result of free exchange and of them actually exercising their individual sovereignty. It's a false consciousness that women actually have full choice within the private sphere. So liberalism is implicated in a set of concepts and distinctions that aren't just too slowly dismantling the patriarchal power structure. They're actually part of what's holding up the patriarchal power structure. Other things used to hold up the patriarchal power structure. Prior to liberalism, the conservative notion of a natural social order, and we're each born into a particular place in that order, and this order represents God's will, or at least it represents what's natural and organic in the universe, that upheld the patriarchal power structure. Liberalism has come along as seemingly promising to dismantle the conservative social order, but while it has dismantled that for some men, right, it is given greater mobility and greater opportunities for some men within the public sphere particularly, it has largely reproduced the patriarchal power structure that creates, reproduces, supports women's subjection, women's exploitation, and the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens. So it's not just that we're too slowly keeping the promises of liberalism, that it took 130 years for women to gain the right to vote, that it's taking time for women to migrate to the top of to the top of corporations. It's taking time for women to get good at running for and winning office. That's the liberal claim. Like, no, we ushered in a set of concepts, equality and individual sovereignty, that are tools that can make women's subjection, that we can use to dismantle women's subjection. The feminist critique is no, quite the opposite. These are tools that actually are continuing women's subjection and exploitation. And maybe, at best, all they've done is softened it up around the edges. But that doesn't mean the patriarchal power structure is in danger, right? It just means that the patriarchal power structure is less absolute than it once was, right? There are more women who can gain cultural power, right? It's not as hard in the early 20th century for a woman to be a famous novelist as it was in the early 19th century for a woman to be a famous novelist. There were a few then, there are more now, but that doesn't shift in any meaningful way the amount of cultural power. It doesn't crack into the basic set of differential expectations that dictate a different place in the overall power structure for women and for men. So liberalism is seen not just as, well, it's not as helpful as it could be, but on paper it looks good. It's actually seen as the stuff on paper and the distraction from the reality, as well as the maintenance of this line, which allows any inequalities here to be perpetuated in the name, allegedly, of individual sovereignty, that liberalism is actually a tool the newer and probably better, more successful tool of maintaining the patriarchy than some older conservative notions about social order would be. So it's not just that liberalism is not yet keeping its promises to allow women and men to have equal access to benefits and burdens. It is that it's standing in the way. All right, well, I think that that wraps it up for at least this version of the feminist critique of the patriarchal world. As I said at the beginning, this is not the only thing that, this is not even necessarily the main beating heart of a feminist critique of the patriarchal world but it's the one that's very much germane to this class because it directly attacks the fundamental premises or claims of political liberalism and gets us to think about the fact that, well, on paper, liberalism sounds great. Equality, individual sovereignty, the public-private distinction, letting people choose their own conception of the good and pursue it, allowing there to be public action to define and enforce the harm principle and make sure that when the harm principle has been crossed, when people's actions affect other people, that social, political, cultural, and economic action can be taken to address those wrongs. That all sounds really great. But does it do anything other than sound really great? And that's the question I'll leave you with here at the end of week 9. And next week we're going to wrap up the class. Yeah, with whatever's on this syllabus. I honestly forget. I think we're going to be talking about pluralism and democracy. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. All right. Well, until then, that's the lecture for today.